All right, let's get right into it. Tonight, we're not just reading a history book. We are opening a cold case file. We're going to step into the shadows of ancient Rome, onto the Palatine Hill itself, to investigate two of the most notorious figures in the entire Roman Empire. This is a deep dive into absolute power, into grotesque cruelty, and into the psychological rot that sets in when a man truly believes he's become a god. So let's start with our first piece of evidence. This is a quote, a chilling one, from the Emperor Caligula. And honestly, it's the psychological key that unlocks this entire investigation. Let them hate so long as they fear. Think about that. That's not a political strategy. That's a confession. It reveals a mind that is totally given up on being loved and has replaced that need with an insatiable craving for terror. This right here is where the madness really takes root. So let's be clear about how we're approaching this. Think of it as a historical true crime story. We're not just going to be listing off dates and names. No, we're examining a crime scene, one that spans an entire empire. The number of victims is, well, it's countless. And the perpetrators? Two of the most powerful men who have ever lived. Our job here is to figure out what happens when the very fragile human psyche is handed unchecked, absolute power. To really get a handle on the scale of their crimes, you first have to understand the kind of power they had. See, a Roman emperor wasn't just a king or some president. He was the supreme commander of the legions, the final word in law, and the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. His word wasn't just law, it was reality. His enemies, they just vanished, and his whims could, and did, bankrupt nations. He was, for all practical purposes, a living god. And that is an incredibly dangerous thing for any person to start believing about themselves. Okay, so let's introduce our two main subjects. On the surface, their stories are almost spookily similar. Both Caligula and Nero, they came into power with so much promise, so much hope from the people. But as you can see, both of their reigns just curdled into something monstrous. Caligula's fall was fast and brutal, a 4-year nosedive into paranoia, sadism, and just off-the-charts megalomania. Nero's, on the other hand, was more of a slow burn, taking place over 14 years. It was a journey into this depraved narcissism that demanded the entire world be his personal stage. They are essentially parallel case studies in the pathology of power, and we are going to dissect them both. Every monster has an origin story. And the big question for our investigation is, where did it all go so wrong? So let's start digging through the evidence from their early days on the throne. We're looking for those turning points, those moments where a ruler who seemed promising began to twist into a tyrant. And this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was the madness always in them, just coiled up, waiting for the trigger of absolute power? Or did the power itself create the monster? The historical accounts left behind by people like Suetonius, they suggest a really terrifying pattern, a series of symptoms that started showing up long before their reigns hit their bloody, catastrophic endings. So let's examine the first major symptom. And here's the crucial thing to understand. Their madness first showed itself as this deep, all-consuming narcissism. We're not talking about simple arrogance here. We're talking about a genuine belief that they were divine, that their genius was unparalleled. They didn't just want to be emperors. They wanted to be gods, legendary artists and heroes. And they were more than willing to force the entire world to stand up and applaud. 3.5 miles. That's almost 5.5 kilometers. Just let that number sink in for a second. This isn't the length of some useful public road or a vital aqueduct. No, this is the length of a bridge Caligula built for one reason, and one reason only, to prove a point to his own massive ego. The details here are what really show you the sheer, pointless absurdity of this whole project. Caligula literally rounded up trading ships from all over the place, crippling commerce in the process, just to line them up and build a floating road. And for 2 straight days, he put on a show for himself. First, he paraded across, wearing a golden cloak like some great conqueror. The next day, he raced across in a chariot. This wasn't about building something useful for the public. This was a monument to delusion, paid for with the entire treasury of an empire. Now let's pivot to Nero, because if Caligula's monument to himself was physical, Nero's was theatrical. He was suffering from the exact same core delusion, but for him it came out as this desperate, pathetic need to be seen as the world's greatest artist. He didn't build bridges out of boats, he built entire parades out of forced adoration. And this just perfectly illustrates the depth of his narcissism. A Roman triumph was the absolute highest honor. It was reserved for generals who had conquered foreign enemies and expanded the empire. Nero gave himself one for winning music and acting competitions in Greece. He literally rode into Rome in the very same chariot as the great Augustus, but not with captured enemy banners. With crowns, he won for poetry. Just try to picture the scene: the Emperor of Rome demanding the honors of a war hero for being a decent harpist. It is pathetic, it is utterly bizarre, and it's a terrifying look inside a mind that has completely lost touch with reality. These delusions of grandeur, they were just the beginning. See, once an emperor starts believing he's a god, human lives become pretty meaningless. So now we turn to the darkest part of our case file. We're going to take an unflinching look at the acts of sadistic cruelty that came to define their reigns. And a warning here, the evidence gets pretty disturbing. This quote from Suetonius about Caligula is just a chilling piece of psychological evidence. I mean, it's one thing to order an execution. It is something else entirely to micromanage the suffering. This reveals a sadistic pleasure in the pain of other people. He didn't just want his victims dead, he wanted to savor the act of them dying. He was famous for this sort of thing, forcing parents to watch their own sons' executions, even turning the palace into a brothel staffed by the wives and daughters of senators. But while Caligula's cruelty was often broad and public, his became intensely personal. And with Nero, the cruelty gets incredibly personal and breaks one of society's biggest taboos. We're going to start his indictment with one of the most heinous crimes you could possibly imagine in Roman society: the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. This wasn't some political purge. This was the ultimate act of betrayal. But what's so fascinating from an investigative point of view is what happened next. According to the historical record, Nero was psychologically destroyed by what he did. He was terrified, supposedly haunted by her ghost. He actually hired magicians to try to contact her spirit so he could beg for forgiveness. He, the Emperor of Rome, was so scared of divine payback that he wouldn't go to certain sacred religious ceremonies. This wasn't the action of a cold, calculating killer. This was the act of a deeply unstable man who then completely shattered his own mind. And once he crossed that line, murdering his own mother, well, nobody was safe. That act just opened the floodgates. His case file quickly expands to include aunts, tutors, governors, and really anyone he saw as a threat, or more often than not, just an obstacle to his own greed. So let's take a closer look at Nero's file. The pattern is just crystal clear. His aunt, Domitia, she's on her sickbed, and he has her overdosed with purgatives just to get his hands on her estate faster. This pattern of greed and paranoia, by the way, was something Caligula was known for too, inventing treason charges against rich citizens just to confiscate their fortunes. For Nero, his tutors, the very men who guided him to power, poisoned. The Roman nobility? He literally uses the appearance of a comet as an excuse for a wholesale slaughter. It's a clear, horrifying pattern of paranoia, greed, and a total disregard for human life that both of these men shared. A reign of terror like this, it just can't last forever. Eventually, the world pushes back. And now we come to the final act of this tragedy. This is where the Roman world, stretched to its absolute breaking point, finally turned on its monstrous emperor. The whole house of cards, it started to collapse. Now just look at how fast it all falls apart. For 14 years, this man was untouchable. Then, in March of 68 AD, one governor way out in Gaul decides he's had enough and revolts. A month later, Spain joins him. And Nero, the living god, the supreme artist, he completely crumbles. He faints, he panics, he has absolutely no idea what to do. Within 3 months of that first revolt, the Senate, which had trembled before him for years, suddenly finds its spine and declares him an enemy of the state. He's forced to flee his own capital city, in disguise like a common criminal. And in these final days, his mind, which was already fractured, just completely shatters. Suetonius claims his nights were filled with absolute terror. He dreamed he was losing control of his ship, a pretty clear metaphor for losing control of the state. He dreamed his wife, Octavia, whom he'd had murdered, was dragging him down into darkness. It seemed like the supernatural world itself was conspiring against him. The tomb of Augustus mysteriously flying open, voices calling his name. Now, whether these were real omens or just the projections of a guilty, terrified mind, the effect was exactly the same: a complete and total psychological collapse. So how does a tyrant die? Does he go down fighting, a monster to the bitter end? Or does that whole facade just crumble away to reveal something small, pathetic, and terrified underneath? For the answer, let's examine Nero's final moments. The end? It wasn't grand. It wasn't defiant. It was just pitiful. He wakes up at midnight, completely alone, abandoned by everyone. He's running through the halls, begging for someone, anyone, to kill him. And his most heartbreaking cry is, "Have I then neither friend nor foe?" The most powerful man in the world has no one left. He can't even bring himself to end it all until he hears the alternative, being flogged to death like a common criminal. It's the fear of that indignity, not some noble courage, that finally pushes him over the edge. And here we have it, his final words. As he's lying there, bleeding out, what is his final thought? It's not about his crimes, it's not about his countless victims, or the empire he completely ruined. No, his final thought is about himself and his own perceived artistic genius. What an artist is now about to perish. It's the ultimate pathological narcissistic statement. He was completely delusional, right up to his very last breath. And that brings our investigation to a close, but it leaves us with one final, very chilling question. You see, the stories of Caligula and Nero, they're not just ancient history. They are powerful, timeless cautionary tales about what absolute power can do to a person. They force us to ask ourselves, when you remove all the checks, all the balances, all the consequences from a single human being, is madness just a possibility? Or is it the inevitable, terrifying result?